The Ukrainian incursion into the Russian Kursk region during August, and technically still ongoing at the time of the producing of this video, is likely considered one of the most pivotal moments of the Russo-Ukrainian War in 2024 so far. The development has the potential to turn the tide of the war to Ukraine's advantage. When the invasion began on August 6th, many considered that it would be a temporary assault on enemy territory. After all, Kursk wasn't near the hot zone that is the Ukrainian Eastern Front, primarily the Donetsk region. The best explanation strategists could have at the time was that the Kursk incursion was a measure to force Putin to spread out his forces a bit more and provide much-needed relief to Ukrainian soldiers fighting to defend their homeland in eastern Ukraine. But nobody could have predicted what ended up happening. Within a few weeks, Ukraine managed to occupy roughly 500 square miles of Russian territory. That is, by all accounts, more than Russia has done throughout the entire year so far. The implications of this are many, but we'll get back to that a bit later, so keep watching. More importantly, recent interviews with Ukrainian President Zelensky suggest that Ukraine will keep occupying the territory indefinitely. No, that doesn't mean that they will try to force Russia to cede the Kursk region to Ukraine when it's all over. However, Kursk presents a long-lasting thorn in Russia's strategy, so Ukraine will keep its occupying forces at the ready to defend the area and keep control of it throughout the remainder of the war. It's obvious that the invasion of Kursk has been planned for a long time, all the while keeping those plans a secret from the US, ostensibly the largest Ukrainian ally. This comes straight from Washington, where President Joe Biden's administration denied knowing about any forward-moving plans from Ukraine. According to Zelensky, not even all Ukrainian intelligence services knew about the bold battle plan to invade Kursk. Zelensky noted that he shrunk to the maximum circle of people who knew about this operation and thinks it was one of the reasons why it was successful. And it's more than likely that this was by design too. Taking a back step to survey the bigger picture, the success of the Kursk invasion has a pretty clear catalyst. Putin didn't bother to provide more forces to defend it, but the implications of Russia's reasoning behind that reveal far more about Russia's ability to prolong this war than at first glance. So let's examine exactly how Ukraine invading and holding Kursk is going to be vital for the remainder of the Russo-Ukrainian War. We'll start with the Kursk invasion itself and what it meant for the progress of the war at the time. By late July 2024, Russia had spent a significant amount of resources trying to pile-drive its way further into eastern Ukraine. However, Putin made a significant error in judgment. He decided to advance on Kharkiv again after the entire region was successfully defended by the Ukrainians. The scope of the attack was perplexing at best. The main stage of the campaign, subsequently dubbed the Summer Campaign, started in mid-May 2024, with small incursions into the Kharkiv region by Russian forces. But that wasn't the weird part in and of itself. It was the tactics that Russia decided to implement that threw away any advantage it might have had. You see, for the past 30 months of the conflict, there was one advantage that Russia had and could rely on to drive forward: resource advantage. This came in many forms. Russia at that point was one of the most well-prepared national militaries in the world, easily ranking in the top 3 by sheer number of vehicles and airplanes it could field at any time. Sure, it quickly became clear that the main Russian tanks, T-72s, T-80s and T-90s, were no match for the advanced tanks like the M1 Abrams that the US could field. After all 3 T-tanks suffered from a similar yet major design flaw that allowed Ukraine to drag the war into trench, mine and drone warfare. The aforementioned tanks all use an automatic reloading system that houses spare ammunition below the turret. However, the ammunition housing is perilously undefended by battle armor. Since Ukraine also fielded some T-72s, as they are a Soviet design and were inherited after the collapse of the Union, the Ukrainian army quickly realized that a mine or a bomb could puncture through the housing and possibly detonate the armor. Despite this, Russia still had a significant field advantage with their tanks. Ukraine hasn't received nearly as many advanced tanks from the US and Europe as it hoped. Both sides of the war had to rely on Soviet-era machinery to take them through it, and Russia was the only side that could actually manufacture new parts. Russia's manufacturing and industry were advanced enough that Putin proclaimed that the military complex was prepared to deliver 1,500 tanks in 2023. Even if most of those tanks turned out to be refurbished Soviet-era models, Ukraine still had plenty to worry about if the Russian army decided to put all those tanks to use. But Russia didn't. The summer invasion turned out to be a mess of poor strategic decisions. Rather than pressing on with its tank advantage, Russia used mainly infantry-based tactics to try to invade Kharkiv. According to field reports from Ukrainian soldiers after the summer invasion settled, some strategies went so far as to get soldiers on motorcycles so they could dodge Ukrainian fire and reach the trenches. The main armored vehicles were more akin to turtle tanks, slow but heavily fortified vehicles that only had the goal of soaking up fire for the surrounding infantry. It quickly became clear that the northern front was set up as a diversion for the main effort in eastern Ukraine. To end that, Russia eschewed trying to mount a more technologically or mechanically superior offensive on Kharkiv. The goal was to pull as many Ukrainian defenders from the eastern front to the north so Donetsk could fall while it was undefended. On paper, this idea had merit, mainly due to another resource advantage Russia possessed: manpower. By the end of 2023, the Russian military was estimated to have around 1.3 million troops at its disposal, with the total military personnel surpassing 3 million people. This was largely due to Russia's aggressive conscription efforts, pulling in roughly 35,000 new soldiers every month, and the country's vast pools of mercenary companies. It didn't hurt that Russia has roughly twice the population of Ukraine, and therefore has the potential to pull from roughly twice as many people to make up its military. However, Russian troops seemed to be outmatched on the northern front, and there was one significant clue as to why: Russia was churning through experienced personnel. When the war started, Russia had around 300,000 troops stationed near Ukraine. These were, by all accounts, people who had extensive army training and knew what they were doing. But Ukraine managed to repel the initial onslaught, even if it took until the end of 2022 for Russia to withdraw from northern Ukraine. What followed was a meat grinder. By early 2024, Russian casualties were estimated to be anywhere from 450,000 to 500,000 people, counting both deaths and severe injuries. If we compare this to the earlier number of 300,000, it stands to reason that this could include a significant portion of experienced personnel. Therefore, Russia was likely using relatively new recruits to make up a bulk of its less critical efforts. And that seemed to be the case with the 2024 summer invasion of Kharkiv. According to Ukrainian news outlet Ukrainska Pravda, Russia was losing between 1,000 and 1,200 soldiers every day over May and June. This was the sum of the losses on all fronts. When put together, the summer invasion cost Russia roughly 70,000 soldiers. By the end of July, it was probably clear to Ukraine that the Russian territory to its north was vastly under-equipped and its troops under-trained. The Kursk invasion all but confirmed that. The first wave of the Kursk incursion started with between 300 and 1,000 soldiers crossing the border and moving on to sparsely fortified villages and towns in the southwestern Kursk region. The initial reports were contradictory at best, partially because Ukraine refused to provide official information for the first few days of the incursion. The Russian Ministry of Defense started with reports on how Ukrainian troops were easily fended off and that there was no reason to worry about anything in the Kursk region. That quickly turned out to be as far from the truth as possible. The Kursk invasion turned out to be a wave of Ukrainian troops advancing through the Russian-populated area, with a wave of Russian soldiers surrendering in their wake. According to Kyiv's commander-in-chief, General Alexander Syrsky, the Ukrainian forces managed to capture 594 soldiers as prisoners of war. These troops are a useful tool for Ukraine to bolster its tactic of prisoner exchange, the first waves of which swapped 230 soldiers by August 24th. According to the Ukrainian prisons that are holding these Russian soldiers, roughly 80% of the initial wave of 300 captures is made up of recent recruits. This fact showcases that Ukraine's gambit turned out to be a stroke of genius. Kursk was defended by an army that wasn't trained and had no equipment to withstand Ukrainian shelling and advanced tactics. Ukraine has made several more offensive moves in the Kursk region, including bombing bridges and other vital parts of infrastructure that connects the southern parts of the region to the rest of Russia. This would give Ukraine ample opportunity to consolidate its existing gains in Kursk and take over more of Russia's territory to gain leverage. Throughout all of this, Ukraine has shown a more moral approach to warfare and invasion than Russia ever has over the past 30 months. The Ukrainian occupation has been estimated to have displaced nearly 200,000 civilians. To Ukraine's credit, the army has been working with international humanitarian organizations to expedite the process of providing aid for civilians. The military tactics have also included relatively little destruction of civilian infrastructure. By contrast, Russia has been accused of ignoring several clauses of international humanitarian law, the chief of which included targeting hospitals and shelling civilian buildings that had no military purposes. The discrepancy in how Russia was invading Ukraine and how Ukraine was invading Russia back was a significant advantage for Ukraine's corner of the conflict. This would undoubtedly help stir Ukraine's chief ally, NATO, into providing more aid for Ukraine. Throughout the Kursk invasion, Russia has been adamant about quelling the Ukrainian efforts to gain a larger foothold in its territory. But so far, any attempts by Russia to drive away the troops have not yet yielded significant results. A month in, Ukraine has still managed to hold on to territory it seized, and it doesn't seem like it's going to let go anytime soon. But how does invading and holding parts of Kursk benefit Ukraine? We've already mentioned the first region, attention and the associated funding. Throughout the 30 months of warfare, Ukraine has been in the position of the defender, trying to remove Russia's presence from the country. In fact, some of its plans included making a counteroffensive and liberating part of the Russian-controlled territory. Ukraine publicly showed the narrative of wanting to repel Russia, and Russia was prepared for it. In August 2023, many strategists believed that Ukraine's efforts were for naught and the country was losing far more than it was gaining. Zelensky has noted that the Kursk incursion was precisely made as a strategy that went contrary to how Ukraine was behaving for the past 2 years. If Russia wasn't expecting Ukraine to mount a counter-invasion, and it clearly wasn't, then Ukraine could create an opening. And that's exactly what happened. The Kursk invasion has improved Ukraine's standing not only militarily but geopolitically. The US has announced that it would send another $125 million in military equipment and ammunition to Ukraine less than a week into the invasion. It ostensibly showed that the Biden administration was willing to back Ukraine in its bolder plan. Of course, Ukraine still needs all the help it can get. While Russia has been vocal about driving Ukraine out, the actual efforts have turned even more toward the Donetsk region. As Ukraine captured recruits to its north, Russia was sending more military to the east. The primary target over the past month has been the city of Pokrovsk, with a population of 60,000. The city stands at the crossroads between a few vital roads that connect eastern and central Ukraine. With Russia invading from the east, Pokrovsk has been made into a vital piece of Ukrainian military supply infrastructure. Putin has so far called the Ukrainian offensive on Kursk a mistake. Ukraine clearly sent more experienced units and advanced military equipment to Kursk, which precluded it from reinforcing its eastern front. Russia has seemingly capitalized on that, pushing to just 5 miles away from Pokrovsk. So far, Russia hasn't sent an overwhelming force to liberate Kursk in an attempt to maintain the pressure on the eastern front. Both sides are effectively playing chicken, as shuffling troops between the two fronts makes one liable to fall and create a decisive result. But there's another aspect of the Russo-Ukrainian war that the Kursk invasion has managed to turn on its head. And it's likely the reason why Zelensky is so adamant about keeping the occupied territory under Ukrainian control until the war ends. The answer is, surprisingly, nuclear weapons. Throughout the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Russia has managed to stifle many attempts by NATO to supply Ukraine with advanced military equipment or overwhelming aid. As soon as NATO announced an aid package, Russia would claim that the new resources would present a significant threat to Russia's security and that Putin could launch nuclear weapons. This is part of Russia's 2020 military doctrine that outlines nuclear weapons as the preclusion of the escalation of military actions and their cessation on conditions acceptable to the Russian Federation and/or its allies. The sentence is a fancy way of saying that Russia has decided that it alone is responsible for determining when it decided something is dangerous enough for Russia to make a nuclear response a viable option. It was part of the reason why the US Congress has paused sending aid to Ukraine for 15 months. The saber-rattling tactic was working. Ukraine couldn't get the anti-air missiles, F-16s, Abrams tanks, and a host of other military equipment, or at least not in the numbers Zelensky hoped would be enough to make a difference. And one of the biggest red lines that Russia has drawn was Ukraine pushing onto Russian territory. Before July 2024, that's how it was, but all that went out the window the moment Ukraine managed to not only invade Russia, but occupy 500 square miles of it and keep it under control for over a month at the time of the making of this video. By Russia's own military doctrine and nuclear threats, this should have been enough to cause significant fallout, perhaps literally. But the threats of nuclear warfare remain just threats, and NATO can now see that. That's exactly why Ukraine is adamant about holding onto the territory it seized. It shows that Russia's threats are empty and that it would eventually have to mount a significant offensive to push the Ukrainian troops back across the border. Even better for Ukraine, one of the later responses by Russia was to make trenches around key parts of the region, including separating major roads or power plants. While this is a solid effort by Russia to minimize its losses in the region, it also gives more options to Ukraine. Considering the overall failure of the Russian military strategy to account for Ukraine pushing into Kursk, the new trenches could be used against Russia. If Ukraine manages to maintain momentum and capture areas surrounding the trenches, it can use them as fortifications against future Russian responses. In effect, Russia could end up spending more time, money and manpower to make Kursk more defensible, but against Russia itself. Recently though, Ukraine has revealed that there are a few more reasons why it wants to cling to Kursk. According to Syrskyi, Ukraine believed that Kursk was being set up as a launchpad for another invasion into Ukrainian territory later in the year. The decisive incursion has managed to both stifle that effort and force Russia to ease the pressure in other regions. Syrskyi has mentioned that Russia hasn't managed to make any progress towards Pokrovsk in the first week of September. This has showcased that Ukraine's strategy of occupying Kursk has worked past the short-term Russian response in August. Even more importantly, Ukraine's invading Russia has presented a significant morale shift in Russia's people. Before August, Russia was sternly on the offensive. This meant that Russian citizens, particularly those from Moscow and other heavily urban areas, weren't nearly as affected by the wartime atmosphere. In fact, Russia's conscription efforts overwhelmingly targeted poorer regions, typically populated by minorities. In some reports, there was an estimate that a conscript from Siberia was more than 50 times more likely to die than a Muscovite, purely because there weren't that many Muscovites in the more recent waves of conscription. Ukraine being able to hold Kursk will possibly show Russian citizens that they do have something to fear after all, and that the war could reach their doorstep. This isn't an empty threat either. On August 21st, Ukraine mounted a drone attack directly on the Russian capital. The 11 deployed drones were shot down by Russian anti-air defenses before they could reach their targets, which remain unidentified. However, this sets up a dangerous precedent for Russia. Apart from Ukraine holding onto Kursk, it could use it to strike deeper into Russia's territory. Ukraine has been successful in obtaining the much-needed missiles and long-range capabilities, as well as developing a line of long-range military drones. And more importantly, Ukraine has fortified its air presence as the F-16s have finally started taking flight in August. While Ukraine has received fewer F-16s from NATO, none from the US itself, the fleet of 65 aircraft will be a sizable boost to Ukraine's air forces. After all, the F-16 is considered one of the most advanced fourth-generation fighter jets, especially being more cost-effective and maneuverable than its Russian rival, the Su-27. The influx of F-16s will allow Ukraine to maintain a firmer grip on its hard-fought territory and remove yet another of Russia's advantages from the war equation. So where does that put Russia? Russia might still have the material advantage after all. Its military is practically being rebuilt every day and its numbers are going strong. However, the recent waves of NATO military aid have quickly closed the gap between Russia and Ukraine's technological capabilities. Both sides are increasingly relying on long-distance strikes, particularly drone warfare, which almost removes traditional infantry from the equation. While Russia has managed to land one of the more devastating missile strikes of the war, killing 51 people and injuring 270, Ukraine's efforts have been nothing short of spectacular. Ukraine has carved its way through Russia's navy with sea-deployed drones, freeing up vital ports in the south to reopen maritime trade and refresh its economy. The country has also received more than $250 billion in funding from the US and European countries, whether in military or direct financial aid, helping it to stay afloat. On the other hand, Russia has been relying on its energy sector and trading oil and natural gas to China and India, as Western sanctions dried up the influx of US dollars into Russia. While Russia's economy has momentarily bounced back, breaking the International Monetary Fund's predictions, this is unlikely to remain a viable long-term strategy. Russia's reliance on external trade with China means that it's dependent on staying in China's graces, and that China will actively continue to need Russia's resources. Based on China's recent spearheading of the Belt and Road Initiative, the Middle East might overtake Russia as China's biggest supplier in oil and gas. If that happens, Russia will lose much of its trade income. The energy sector, which is practically the only external-facing industry in the country, can collapse in on itself and drag the rest of the country down with it. And this threat of Russian collapse is exactly what Ukraine is hoping to accentuate by keeping Kursk under Ukrainian control. If Russia can't overwhelm Ukraine militarily and lets it hold on to parts of Russia, the political losses, both internal and external, could be too much for Putin's regime to handle. Zelensky seems to be fully aware of that and has been hinting at Kursk being a part of the wider plan to propose a peace agreement with Russia. With the next peace summit being held in November, Zelensky is clearly expecting that Ukraine will be able to maintain its grip on Kursk until then. If that remains true, Russia will be under increasing pressure over the coming months to determine how long it can keep the war going and whether its efforts are worth it after all. But what do you think? Will Ukraine be able to hold Kursk? Will Russia agree to hold peace negotiations in November? Leave your comments and thank you for watching. Now go and check out Analyzing the Ukrainian Invasion into Russia Day by Day, or click this other video instead.